I am Sister Barbara Reed, President of Catholic Theological Union, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this very important conversation this evening. From the very founding days of Catholic Theological Union in 1968, we have had the great privilege of a strong partnership with the Jewish community. Rabbi Chaim Perlmutter of blessed memory was a founding faculty member who, along with Father John Pawlikowski, one of our panelists this evening, created the Catholic Jewish Studies program at CTU. And we're so delighted that Rabbi Perlmutter's wife, Nancy, is with us tonight, as well as their son, Michael. Rabbi Perlmutter was a beloved member of CTU's faculty for more than 30 years, after which the mantle was taken up by Rabbi David Sandmel. And now the Catholic Jewish Studies program at CTU is led by Dr. Malka Zeiger-Simkovich, who will guide us through tonight's program. But first, I would like to invite you to pause for a moment of prayer. I invite you to reflect on Psalm 133, a text sacred to both Jews and Christians, which celebrates the blessedness of unity among pilgrims going up to Jerusalem. How good and pleasant it is when brothers and sisters live together in unity. It is like the precious oil on the head, running down upon the beard, on the beard of Aaron, running down over the collar of his robes. It is like the dew of Hermon, which falls on the mountains of Zion. For there, the Holy One ordained blessing, life forevermore. And so we pray that all peoples may live in the kind of harmony in which the psalmist exults, all of us seeking oneness with God and one another. May tonight's conversation and the actions that follow from it be a balm of healing and refreshment, like the images of oil and dew in the psalm. May the Holy One grant us this blessing, which we so earnestly seek. Peace, shalom, salam, amen.
Thank you, Sister Barbara, and good evening. My name is Malka Simkovich. I'm the Director of Catholic Jewish Studies and serve as Chair of Jewish Studies at Catholic Theological Union. I want to thank you all for taking the time to attend this evening's panel discussion on anti-Semitism in America. I also want to recognize my colleagues, Dr. Stephen Millies, Director of CTU's Bernardine Center, which houses and enthusiastically supports our Catholic Jewish Studies program. Mr. Peter Cunningham, Associate Director of the Bernardine Center, who puts countless hours into preparing for this and many other Catholic Jewish dialogue events. And Ms. Colleen Urbaniak, who works tirelessly with our center to organize and market our programming. My colleagues and I first gathered to plan for this panel just before the presidential election back in November. None of us could have imagined that just 2 months later, extremist militia groups would storm our nation's capital in a deadly assault, emboldened by hateful rhetoric and animated by anti-Semitic and racist slogans, and that our country would elect numerous officials who openly subscribe to conspiracy theories, which include the claim that powerful Jews are leading a deep state effort to gain global control and enslave the American people. While many of my Jewish friends are prone to laugh at the absurdity of these accusations, such claims are in fact quite serious, given the reality that so many people actually believe them. These events, moreover, have taken place in the public sphere to the surprise of many Americans, some of whom have never personally seen such brazen displays of Jew hatred in our country. In a way, we can be grateful that the public nature of the riots in Washington has foregrounded a form of anti-Semitism which has long existed, but which many of us do not actively reckon with. Today, we have an unprecedented opportunity to contend with Jew hatred communally as a societal challenge which we must proactively work to overcome. Yet while it is easy enough to recognize and condemn an extreme and virulent form of Jew hatred, it is more difficult to discern other forms of anti-Semitism, which also appear in social discourse, forms which take on subtle expression in theological discussions, religious spaces, and academic campuses. These expressions can be hard to identify and harder to interpret. The premise of tonight's event is that Jew hatred is not a domain which belongs exclusively to a single political party, a single religion, or even a single ideology, but that those who engage in Jew hatred take part in a broader pattern which may not be widely understood. Because anti-Semitism has so many manifestations, we decided to bring together 3 leading scholars who are uniquely qualified to address these issues, having devoted their careers to studying how anti-Semitism finds expression in various societies. I will ask these scholars to share their insight on how recent events might be interpreted within broader patterns of Jewish history and what they might tell us about the nature of American identity. I will also ask them to share their thoughts on the question of whether we are experiencing a moment of rupture or the birth pangs of self-awareness that will bring us to a place of healing and justice. Dr. Miriam Elman is the Executive Director of the Academic Engagement Network and Associate Professor of Political Science at Syracuse University, where she holds the title of McClure Professor of Teaching Excellence at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. An award-winning scholar and teacher, Dr. Elman has edited and co-edited 6 books and is the author of over 65 journal articles and book chapters. Recently, Professor Elman co-edited Word Crimes, Reclaiming the Language of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, a special issue of the leading academic journal, Israel Studies. Dr. Pamela Nadell holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, where she directs the Jewish Studies program and received the university's highest award, Scholar Teacher of the Year. Her books include Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, 1889 to 1985, and America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, which won the National Jewish Book Award and Everett Family Foundation Jewish Book of the Year in 2019. She is a past president of the Association for Jewish Studies and the recipient of the American Jewish Historical Society's Lee Max Friedman Award for Distinguished Service. Finally, Father John Pawlikowski is the founding director of Catholic Theological Union's Catholic Jewish Studies program, where for 50 years he forged into uncharted territory, applying the teachings of Nostra Aetate to build a lasting relationship with the Jewish community, both locally and internationally. Father Pawlikowski is a founding member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and served as president of the International Council of Christians and Jews from 2002 to 2008. The recipient of numerous honorary doctorates and awards, including the Nostra Aetate Award from the Archdiocese of Chicago and the Shevet Achim Award from the Council of Centers on Jewish-Christian Relations, Father Pawlikowski is the author of dozens of books and articles on the subject of Jewish-Christian relations. Truth be told, if I were to give you the full biographies of our 3 panelists and their many accomplishments, our hour together would be up by the time I would finish. Before we get started, please remember to mute yourselves and note that we will have an opportunity for questions and answers towards the end of the hour. So please feel free to post questions in the chat box, or if you like, you can send them directly to me or Mr. Peter Cunningham. And I would like to open our conversation by inviting each of the panelists to introduce themselves and to speak for a few minutes about how they bring their scholarship into conversation with contemporary events. I would like to begin alphabetically with Dr. Elman. Dr. Elman, if you please.
Thank you so much, Malka, and thank you, President Reed, for the opportunity to join you this evening, along with my esteemed panelists. It's really a pleasure. I'm the executive director of the Academic Engagement Network. We are an educational nonprofit headquartered in DC, We work with about 800 faculty around the country on some 260 campuses. And we're committed to addressing anti-Semitism on campus, to advancing the rigorous study of Israel and the Middle East, and to defend campus free speech and academic exchange. Like many other Jewish and civil rights organizations, we are appalled by the rising anti-Semitic incidents in the country and on our college campuses. We work to address it in many ways by funding a range of campus programming, by helping to train diversity officials and other administrators to better recognize anti-Semitism and to speak out against it. We also give our faculty members the tools and resources that they need to address anti-Semitism on the campus, if and when it appears. My own research focuses on conflict resolution. I've done work on the nexus between religion and politics in the Middle East and on the city of Jerusalem. And recently, largely because of my work at AEN, I've been researching anti-Semitism on the American far left. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Nadell, please.
Thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me and for being part of this very distinguished panel. I'm going to explain how, for me, thinking about anti-Semitism has actually kind of factored into my scholarship and my teaching. And, you know, we always hope that we're going to see this unusual intersection. So I had never taught a course on anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism, I found that over the years, I ended up speaking about it and writing about it in various different locations. So for example, for many years, I actually gave a long, like 3-hour-long lecture on the history of anti-Semitism for the Anti-Defamation League's program Bearing Witness, which brought many Catholic school educators to Washington, D.C. to learn about the history of anti-Semitism. But in that era, this program was sponsored by the Holocaust Memorial Museum, but they were not allowed to talk about the long history of anti-Judaism. They could only start with racial anti-Semitism. And so I was the person who would give them this long lecture in one day on the long history of anti-Judaism. Then a couple of years ago, I actually found myself testifying before Congress in 2017 on something called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. And this wasn't anything that I sought out, but I got asked to speak about it and about the tension between that act and questions around free speech and whether or not Congress should be legislating a definition of anti-Semitism. And we'll probably talk more about defining anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, I was writing my book, America's Jewish Women, A History, and I would keep coming up with examples of Jewish women who had faced anti-Semitism. I'll give you just one. After World War II, beauty pageant contestant Bess Meyerson saw 3 out of the 5 sponsors of the Miss America pageant walk away after she won Miss America because they did not want a Jewish woman representing them. So I found myself thinking, you know, as I look back, I've taught about anti-Semitism, I've thought about it, but in more than 3 decades of teaching at American University, I had never taught a course on anti-Semitism. I have taught the Holocaust, but it was this moment and the changes that we've been seeing in the past couple of years that made me realize that I really needed to develop an entire course on the long history of anti-Semitism. So the course that I've taught now twice is called Anti-Semitism Enduring Hatred. It's actually a freshman seminar, and because it's a freshman seminar, we get to do really wonderful things. We read a wide array of literature, we see museum exhibitions, documentaries, feature films, we listen to podcasts, we really do all sorts of different ways of encountering the subject. But I want to tell you how I teach the course, how I kind of break it down. So there's a whole section on what is anti-Semitism. We even have a whole conversation about how to spell the word. Then we have a big section on from anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism, where we talk about both Christian anti-Judaism and then the racial anti-Semitism. But the last unit, it reflects my own area of expertise. And I'm a historian of the American Jewish community. So my question is America different? And then we answer this by looking at periods in American history where we see anti-Semitism exploding in different ways. But there's a very contemporary component to the class. I have my students set a news alert for anti-Semitism, and then they have to give an oral and written report on some news story that they found. When I was designing the course, I figured there was going to be plenty of material, and sadly, I was correct. So my students have brought amazing stories about anti-Semitism in different places. Not surprisingly, they're really interested in popular figures in music and in sports and social media. They talk about anti-Semitic videos on TikTok. I've never been on TikTok, but they have. They talk about anti-Semitism on campuses, so a lot of what Miriam has been talking about. And last semester, I had a student from Pittsburgh, and she presented stories about 4 events that happened after the Tree of Life shooting. And they were events that took place in Pittsburgh, and she had participated in these events. And she had the class with tears in our eyes. She was so extraordinary that next semester I plan to bring her to class the next time I teach the course. This moment has also prompted me in my new research to be working on this intersection between anti-Semitism and gender, because I work on gender. And that's a subject that has not been explored in the American past. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. And for our last introduction, Father John Pawlikowski.
Well, as already been said, I've been at this for more or less a half a century. How did I get involved? I got involved actually initially when I was still in the seminary. And one of my professors at the time was the noted scripture scholar, not uncontroversial in many circles, John Dominic Crossan. He was then a member of my own religious order. So we became, I became one of his special students. John Dominic Crossan was very interested and passionate about the issue of anti-Semitism. And he, in fact, developed the first major published article on this subject immediately after the close of the Second Vatican Council and the issuance of the Declaration Nostra Aetate on the Church's relationship to non-Christians, with a special focus on the relationship with the Jewish community in chapter 4. Subsequently, he gave a major lecture based on that at Loyola University here in Chicago, and I was there. But it was really he who gave me the initial kind of push to become serious about this history of anti-Semitism. I also came to know Father Edward Flannery, who a priest from the Catholic Diocese of Providence, who wrote the first kind of substantive book on titled The Anguish of the Jews, which resulted from, interestingly enough, a walk that he had with a Jewish friend on Park Avenue in New York at Christmas time. And as you walk down towards the old Pan Am building, there was a cross illuminated in the windows of the building. And his Jewish friend said to him, "That cross makes me shudder." And Flannery says he was so taken by that he decided to really work on this book, which really was a groundbreaking book in the terms of the history of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism in the Catholic Church. Flannery is famous for an iconic remark that he made, which is in the introduction to the book, in which he said, one of the problems we face as Catholic Christians is that Jews know very well the pages that have been torn out of the average Christian textbook. In other words, the Jews know the history of Catholic anti-Semitism until in a way, the Vatican Council. Few Christians really understood the challenge that anti-Semitism poses for them, their religious belief and their theological outlook. I eventually became involved, thanks to the American Jewish Committee, in a tri-faith project funded by the Ford Foundation under the direction of the American Jewish Committee. And that involved analyzing the textbooks in Catholic Christianity, Protestant Christianity, and in the Jewish tradition, and how those textbooks presented some 9 religious and racial outgroups in the materials. And these were the most widely used textbooks in each of the religious communities. The Protestant studies were done at Yale University, and the Catholic studies were done at St. Louis University, and the Jewish study was done at the old Dropsy College in Philadelphia. In the Catholic studies, there was a division into 3 parts. It was first literature textbooks, secondly, historical materials, and finally, theological materials. The theological books, the religious education materials, were left for last because of the fear that these would really cause great controversy if, in fact, they were critiqued. It was okay to critique literature, was okay to critique history, but when you got to religion textbooks, that became an extremely sensitive topic. And the religion textbook studies were done by Dr. Sister Rose Thiering, who eventually worked for many years at Seton Hall University, especially dedicated to teacher education within the state of New Jersey and beyond. But these textbook studies clearly showed the negativity of attitudes towards Jews, and clearly showed that the notion that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ and suffered consequences as a result, and that the Pharisees were the arch enemies of Jesus. This was still prevalent in textbooks at the beginning of the 1960s. It's interesting that when they presented the results of the religion studies at St. Louis University in a public event, Sister Rose, who was a great friend of mine, told me you could cut the tension with a knife. And eventually some Monsignor who was in the audience was so upset, he called the bishop of the diocese, i.e. Milwaukee, where her mother house was, where the headquarters of her Dominican community was, and said that there is a nun here hanging out our dirty linen. Well, when she finally met the bishop to discuss this, and this is in the film about Sister Rose, which was nominated for an Academy Award. She said to the bishop, told her not to hang out the dirty linen of Catholicism, and she said, I'm going to hang it out anyway. She was quite a determined woman. That was, when I began my doctoral studies, I also encountered 2 people, the late Dr. Kurt Reilersdam, a Protestant biblical scholar at the University of Chicago, who was one of the real pioneers in the area of improving Christian-Jewish understanding. He didn't write that much. He wrote some articles and so on, but he was a real influence on me. We became close friends, in fact. And then also Dr. Martin Marty, the famous church historian, who actually, his interest was mostly in the more contemporary aspects of the Christian-Jewish relationship. So I kind of got both. And then, of course, my longstanding friendship with Rabbi Perlmutter, and then eventually also with David Sandmel when he took over after Rabbi Perlmutter's death. And those were really, I would describe as spiritual encounters as well as academic encounters, and something that left an intense pressure, a big pressure in a good sense on me in terms of commitment to this effort. One of the things I think that hopefully we will have a chance to discuss right now in this seminar, this webinar, is the relationship between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. What is the more proper term? If we can, in fact, say one is more proper than the other, and how do they interrelate? So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you very much to all three of you. I really want to go back to a comment that Pam made about something that she is teaching regarding the question of whether America is different. We do have this sense that's very pervasive of American exceptionalism, that there's something unique about our country. And I want to build on this, but I can't do that yet because I have to ask a preliminary question, and that does have to do with definitions. The question of what the difference is between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. How do you discern these two categories? I also, by the way, tell my students to not write anti-Semitism with a dash or to capitalize the S. I'm careful about that. But also, you might have noted in my introduction, I talked about Jew hatred because I actually don't love the term anti-Semitism. And so I want to turn this to you, perhaps beginning with Dr. Elman, but I'd like to hear from all three of you regarding the question of definitions. Do you have a way, sort of a systematic way to discern how you use anti-Semitism versus anti-Judaism, whether you prefer one over the other, and how you define them to your students? So please, Dr. Elman.
Sure, thank you. Well, we often hear that anti-Semitism is difficult to define, and I think there is a truth to that. It is hard to come up with one definition that would perfectly fit all the ways hatred of Jews has been manifested across time and place. But I do think that we can come up with specific features of anti-Semitism, and also to note that it does operate, in fact, differently than other types of bigotry, for example, anti-Black racism. Jews are the only people on the planet for which prejudice has both a low and a high status. Jews are depicted as unclean and parasitic, but they're also depicted as centrally important, diabolical, the purveyors of all evil, wealthy, secretly in control. I think that's what really is what makes anti-Semitism distinct from other types of hate and other types of prejudice. In essence, anti-Semitism is a kind of superstition. It's a conspiracy in which Jews play a starring role. It's a type of hatred based on a negative portrait of the Jew as an extraordinarily malevolent and powerful being. So, for example, in modern times, Jews have been reviled as godless communists and as greedy capitalists, as liberals and as Bolsheviks, as insular nationalists and as rootless cosmopolitans. Today, on the far right, Jews are reviled for using their power and their money to destroy countries from within. They're alleged to be responsible for white genocide and white disempowerment. The charge popular in white supremacist propaganda is that Jews control US immigration policy, and so they are a threat to America's white population. And we can think of the August 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where we heard chanting, "The Jews will not replace us," a direct reference to the idea that Jews are engineering a white genocide, are directly to blame for America's lax policies on immigration and for multiculturalism. Today, we can consider QAnon, the Boogaloo Boys, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, groups whose members breached the Capitol a few weeks ago. They are anti-Black, they are racist groups, but for them, these anti-Semitic conspiracies are also central features. Anti-Semitism, the way I teach it and the way we present it at AEN to our faculty members to then teach it on campus, it involves accusations that Jews are other, that is outside of society, outside of its prevalent culture. Anti-Semitism also frequently charges Jews with conspiring to cause harm. Jews are blamed for why things go wrong. They're held responsible for social, economic, political problems, for crises, for conflicts. Today, also on campus, Jews are cast as threats to human rights and to social justice. Jews are viewed as guilty, 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 guilty for everything and anything that is seen as reprehensible at a given time. And also, Malka, you mentioned how important it is to understand that the hatred of the Jew and of Judaism exists today on both the left and the right of the ideological spectrum. Anti-Semitism can be found among the rich, among the poor, among the more and less educated, among the devoutly religious and the devoutly secular. But the narrative is always the same, and it's the same as it has always been. The Jew as power grabbing and money grubbing, as crafty, as greedy, as selfish, as disloyal outsiders, as conspiring against us and people like us to take what is ours, to control our lives and futures, and to ultimately replace us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to open it to either Dr. Nadell or Father John to also add your thoughts regarding how we might make this distinction. Perhaps Dr. Nadell has insight since she mentioned it in discussion of her courses.
So the first thing I would say is Dr. Elman's description was amazing. That was really incredible. It takes me weeks to teach that in my class. I give my students a number of different definitions. I mean, we have to start with definitions. My personal favorite is from Isaiah Berlin. He defines anti-Semitism as someone who hates Jews more than absolutely necessary. It's nice, short, sweet, it's perfect. But we spend a lot of time talking about anti-Semitism as something that's irrational. And because it's irrational, it is something that we can neither explain nor, frankly, unfortunately, educate away, because there are irrational beliefs that people hold of all different kinds and all different in all different places. So I do want to get to something that Father John said about the terms. So I as a historian, I like to be as exact as I can be, and so the word anti-Semitism is not invented until 1879. And I think we all agree on the spelling. We don't like the capital S or the hyphen, even though Microsoft Word does. But I try in my writing, certainly, and also in my teaching, not to use the word anti-Semitism before then. And I follow the scholarship of a wonderful intellectual historian at the University of Chicago in your own neighborhood, David Nierenberg, who wrote an extraordinary book called Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition. And so I tend to use anti-Judaism before that. But I also know that scholars love to argue. We always need something to argue about. And I have read many articles arguing about what should be the term. I know personally scholars who wish we would return to Judeophobia. But the problem is that, as Father John said, anti-Semitism is what that's a term that everybody knows. So in my writing, I use it. I mean, because that is the term that is part of our English lexicon today.
Well, if I may chime in on that, over the 50 years that I have been involved in the subject of Christian-Jewish relations, I've grappled with the use of terminology in this area. And there is no simple answer in my judgment. One distinction is not, you mentioned already, Dr. Nadell, the kind of the distinction based on time period. Okay, there was no, quote, anti-Semitism before the 1800s in one sense. But in another sense, if you make the distinction as, is it a pure theological view that doesn't necessarily lead to concrete negative acts against Jews, especially the killing of Jews, over against anti-Semitism, which almost always and quite rightly is associated either with significant harassment of Jews, of deprivation, of even social political rights, and in the last instance of death itself. That anti-Semitism is by historical record something that's extremely negative. Now, I think I tend to use anti-Semitism primarily because the anti-Jewish theology, which was forged particularly by the church fathers, the so-called adversus Judaios tradition, the against the Jew tradition, which really was most developed by St. Augustine, did not, and Paula Friedrichsen is correct in saying that that theology did not espouse the actual physical murder of Jews, because Jews were to be kept alive as a sign, a warning sign to Christians to what happens to you if you fail to accept Jesus Christ as Savior. And what happens to you is that you lose your right to the land, you lose your right to social, political equality in the society. You are to live at the margins of society. But I think we need to recognize that even in the more contemporary era, there are people that I would actually call anti-Judaic, but not anti-Semitic. And I would use the example, for example, of a priest from Poland whom the Holocaust, the Illinois Holocaust Museum brought over some years ago to speak because he had saved two sisters who lived in the Chicago suburb of Highland Park. And they recommended, because they were saved by him, they had great respect for him. You couldn't call him an anti-Semite in the sense of, because he risked his life to save these two women, but he was adamant against Nostra Aetate. He wouldn't accept the teaching of the Vatican Council on its new views of Jews. So clearly he was anti-Judaic, but I don't think you could call him anti-Semitic. So there is some, but I think we need to recognize that even modern anti-Semitism, though it might be more biological, it might be more philosophical, nonetheless often draws its imagery from that history of the adversus Judaios tradition, including the things in the Middle Ages about Jews killing children for their blood so that they could put that blood in the matzah and so on. And we still have local saints in many places in Spain where they have festivals to these children who apparently were murdered by Jews. But an interesting thing occurred a couple weeks ago. I was part of a webinar led by Professor Jonathan Sarna, who's already been mentioned, from Brandeis University. And the title of the seminar was The Anti-Semitic Basis of QAnon. And he showed not only by word, but also by visual examples of artwork associated with QAnon. There was one in particular, a large poster that had a picture of an ugly looking Jewish man, had a Star of David on his shirt, and he was standing in a pool of liquid. Now, why do I use the word liquid? Well, you would think it was water, but the poster clearly identified it wasn't water, it was blood. And it was the blood of Hungarians, Ukrainians, and so on and so forth. So this blood libel which have theological basis, religious basis in the Middle Ages, still forms a base, a foundation for much of what we call more non-religious forms of anti-Semitism today. So there, I think we have to see that there's an intimate connection, and certainly when the Gospel of John, describes Jews as having the devil as their father and so on. While I think we can understand that at the time the gospel was written, that may have represented a high level of internal conflict within the Christian Jewish community. But nonetheless, that was interpreted later on in a very in a very anti-Semitic fashion. The issue which has often come up is whether the New Testament is anti-Semitic. It's not anti-Semitic in my judgment in terms of its actual, if you understand the context of the text, but it is anti-Semitic in terms of the way it was often interpreted through the course of Christian history. So again, I don't think you're ever going to completely sort this out in a very nice, clear-cut way. Yes, I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much. And that's actually a great segue, Father Pawlikowski, to ask the question that I referenced earlier concerning what might be new or unique regarding this particular moment in America, and what is new about today's expressions of anti-Semitism on both ends of the political spectrum. I'm also curious to know whether you think we're trending towards something better or worse. And here I really could see both arguments. On the one hand, there's more dialogue than ever particularly between Christians and Jews in our country, but also between other faith communities. There's more education than we've ever had regarding the Holocaust, which in some states like Illinois is mandated in public schools. In the wake of Nostra Aetate, there is so much an abundance of awareness perhaps that we haven't seen in earlier periods among Christian communities. And yet, of course, we also see story after story after story of anti-Semitic incidents occurring in all kinds of ways. And so I really would like to turn it back again to you. Again, what's new about what you're saying, if anything? Perhaps it's not new at all. And what do you think we're trending towards? And I'm wondering if we can go back to Dr. Elman.
Thank you. So, your intro to this question is right on the mark. If we think about earlier periods in American history, right, there used to be quotas to keep Jews out of elite colleges. Now many colleges have Jewish presidents. 60% of Jews in America have completed college or graduate school. Jews were once denied access to country clubs, and they faced a host of other social exclusions. So in that sense, I think we are trending towards something better over time. The US really isn't exceptional. We need to remember that anti-Semitism has existed in this country, whether you look at it at the far right or the far left. You can go back to the Turner Diaries, the 1978 dystopian novel that's very popular today on the far right. There have been elements of anti-Semitism on the right in its populist and nativist pockets. Auto magnate Henry Ford blamed the Jews for World War I. Claimed Jews started wars to profit from them. In the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, Jews were accused of being disloyal or warmongering. The Depression, the New Deal, the threat of war in Europe were all linked to Jewish conspiracy. In 1938, 60% of Americans polled viewed Jews as greedy and dishonest. And as we all know, in 1939, a pro-Nazi rally filled Madison Square Garden. So there were acts against, Jews during the civil rights movement. Synagogues were targeted, and those continued into the 1960s. All that being said, the American Jewish community is experiencing the highest level of anti-Semitic incidents last year ever since tracking began in 1979. According to the FBI, 60% of religiously motivated hate crimes last year targeted Jews, even though Jews make up less than 2% of the population. We're seeing increased vandalism of Jewish cemeteries, dozens of physical assaults against those who look visibly Jewish on the streets of New York City. Deadly attacks, as we know, are on the rise. In the last 2 years, the Tree of Life synagogue attack in Pittsburgh, the Poway in California attack on the synagogue there in April of 2019, the Jersey City attack on a kosher supermarket, the December 2019 attack in Muncie, New York, in a rabbi's home. And all this was after the white supremacist Unite the Right rally in August 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia. So I think we are trending towards something worse in terms of far-right white supremacist violence. But it is important to note that not all these attacks were motivated by far-right ideology, the Jew threatening the white race. A number of the attacks have been committed by the adherents of the Black Hebrew Israelite ideology, which asserts that Jews are fakes and that the true Jews are the indigenous peoples of Africa. The Black Hebrew Israelite attacker in Muncie, who wielded a machete against Jews celebrating Hanukkah, had reportedly used his phone to search for, quote, Zionist temples. The attacker who murdered several Jews at the kosher supermarket in Jersey City was also a Black Hebrew Israelite. His social media referenced Jews as aligned with the devil to carry out a well-planned agenda and to manipulate the American police forces. I think what's really changing isn't the narrative. As John and Pamela have noted, the age-old stereotypes and tropes and canards about Jewish power and money and undue influence are the same as they've always been. But what has changed, I think, is the ease and speed with which they can be disseminated, shared, and spread. The internet has enabled all types of anti-Semitism to spread quicker than ever before. Social media, YouTube, a bonanza for Jew haters. The ADL describes some of these internet sites as the equivalent of a 24/7 neo-Nazi rally. So you can ask yourselves, would the toxic mob that stormed and ransacked the Capitol on January 6th have been able to coalesce in the absence of the internet? Maybe, but there can be no doubt that the internet has made it far easier to get hundreds of thousands of Americans hooked on lies, on disinformation, on a lot of crackpot and kooky ideas, including anti-Semitic disinformation and anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. And I absolutely agree with that. Very, very well said comment. I'd like to go to Dr. Nadell, and I'm wondering whether you have any further insights or comments.
First of all, I agree very much with what Dr. Elman said. I want to just make kind of one interesting point. Fordham University professor Magda Tedder has published a new book about the blood libel. Since we talked about this, on the trail of an anti-Semitic myth, and what she shows stunningly is that we know that the first blood libel emerges in England in 1144, but it doesn't get disseminated as a truth until the printing press emerges. And then the printing press emerges, and here we have this new technology, and it's just an amazing, amazing book, this new technology that allows this idea that Father John was talking about that Jews murder children in order to use their blood for ritual purposes, that we are now seeing repeated in this QAnon cartoon that my friend Jonathan Sarna showed. And I think it's really important to understand that technology has been transformative in so many different manifestations of anti-Semitism. And as Dr. Elman said, right now we're seeing it through social media, but you are absolutely right. It is terrifying what happens in terms of social media. The scariest book I have read on this subject, Talia Lavin's Culture Warlords, shows the extent to which white supremacists center anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, whatever we want to call it, this notion of Jews as controlling the world, center it at the heart of their theories. Yes, they hate Blacks and they hate people of color, but for them, it's the Jews who are pulling the strings of everything. And this is really, for me, a terrifying moment. I think that because of the power of the internet, I'm not sure what could possibly be done. No matter, I mean, Father John has been involved with this work for half a century. This is extraordinary work, but it's like it's out of control now because of the internet.
I can't believe that we're already reaching the end of our hour, and I want to turn to Father John and ask a question. Maybe the other panelists can also add their insights, and then perhaps we'll have time for a question or two from our participants, but we'll have to play this a bit by ear. And Dr. Nadell's comment really brings me to this question that I think came up with Dr. Elman in conversation prior to tonight's panel, which is, we really have to talk about proposed solutions, strategies, best practices. We can't end on this, sort of note of despair, as real as these problems are. So I guess I would turn to Father Pawlikowski, and you've been thinking about this question for 50 years. What do you do? What are some ways to combat this? The internet is not going away. Media is working differently, and that's not going to change either. And, so is there anything we can do? Just unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Yeah, I think first of all, we really have to move beyond the notion that writing a paper statement against anti-Semitism is the end all and be all. These are important, but sometimes they lead to absolutely no follow-up. And that follow-up has to be concrete and, over a period of time. The Bearing Witness program that was mentioned of the ADL, which really was adopted in many Catholic school systems around the United States, was one example of what I would call penetration in a good sense, and so on. I think religious groups generally are very poor in terms of the use of social media. And we are going to have to find ways of really making the case against anti-Semitism where the opposite is being made. In other words, where it's being promoted and enhanced. We have to go in there and have people hear another voice. So I think sometimes we tend to be satisfied. I mean, in the fundamental agreement between the Vatican and the State of Israel, that the preamble said that the Vatican and the State of Israel would become partners in a effort to combat anti-Semitism. I have yet to see any real enfleshment, if I can use that term, of that verbal commitment. There was an article on the Day of Judaism in January in the main Vatican paper by the Secretary of the Holy See's Commission for Religious Relations with Jews. But again, there's no follow-up. And so many of these international dialogues between Catholics and Jews, while they're good, don't have any follow-up, any follow-through. And that, I think, is a major issue.
Thank you very much. Dr. Elman, any thoughts?
So I did want to be able to talk about the campus for just a minute, because there's a different challenge there. I do think that there are things we can do, and that service providers and the internet can do to address online hate, and a number of organizations are working on that, better terms of service, and I think also dealing with severe online misconduct that really isn't currently adequately covered by cybercrime, harassment, and hate crime law. So there are things I think we can do with the internet abuse. But one thing that we want to do on campus, and of course, students can file complaints with the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, as they recently did at New York University and at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, close to your neck of the woods. They can file lawsuits as they did at San Francisco State. But the best way we think at AEN to really combat anti-Semitism on campus is to do what the campus does best, and that is to teach and educate. We feel strongly that university leaders need to speak out against anti-Semitism in exactly the same way that they would against racism and other bigotries. No double standards, and we need to insist on that. There needs to be equal treatment for all as a shared goal. We recently launched an initiative to increase anti-Semitism awareness training for mid-level administrators, specifically diversity and inclusion officials, offices of student life. They often don't understand anti-Semitism. They may not see the needs or concerns of Jewish students as within their purview. They may punt it to Hillel, but don't really realize that it's their job to also address marginalized Jewish community. And they need to protect Jewish students from harassment and marginalization, just like they would other vulnerable groups on campus. One thing that we tell diversity officials and administrators, university leaders, is that contemporary anti-Semitism does not only manifest as a swastika painted on the side of a campus building or on the bathroom stall in a dorm. It also comes in the form of a demonizing and delegitimizing rhetoric about Israel and the demoralization of Zionist students. We want diversity officials and staffers to speak out against these kinds of things, to have conversations, tough dialogue and conversations with student groups so that they know how offensive and obnoxious it is to be told that you can't be fully Jewish on campus, that you can only be the kind of Jew that disavows his or her Zionism, that you can only be the kind of Jew that demonizes Israel. We want them to explain to students in frank and open conversations that this does cross a line. And that's what anti-Semitism awareness training is designed to do. We're working with Hillel International right now to move that programming onto dozens of campuses. There are no quick fixes, exactly as both my colleagues on the panel just said. Combating anti-Semitism, whether off campus or on campus, requires a sustained long-term effort. Thank you.
I'm muted. Yes, please, Dr. Nadell.
I agree. I mean, I think education is what all four of us are in the business of doing. So I like to think that what we teach matters and can make a difference. I'll give you one example from my class last semester. After we started to talk about what's often the elephant in the room, and that is Israel, she said that she finally understood why, when she went to her public health meetings, which were a student-run group that's supposed to promote public health events on campus because that's what she's studying, she finally understood why Israel kept coming up in the conversation at the meetings. And so the more that we can do in terms of education, the better. But I'm not optimistic. I just think that I just think it's getting worse.
You know, I do think that we can use this little conversation that we had tonight with three incredible scholars on the subject as an opportunity for all of us to commit to do something really small, but something that might have lasting and profound effect. If we could do something to educate ourselves further. I know that all three of you've recommended, various scholars. Sometimes some of you have even specified actual books. And so maybe each of us can make a promise to ourselves to educate ourselves a little bit more about these difficult issues, to educate one another, to speak about it in an open and honest and I know often very difficult way, but maybe we can make some kind of a commitment to do something proactive, and that tonight's conversation is the beginning of something that really can have profound and lasting impact. I want to thank each of you again so very much for taking the time to be a part of this conversation. It means a lot to me, to the Bernadine Center, to all of us at CTU that you're here to teach us and that we can learn so very much from you. So thank you so much.